This photograph from 1895 seemed ordinary at first, but everything changed when experts noticed a strange mark on the child's hand. Dr. Rachel Bennett had already spent 3 years organizing old photos at the Tennessee State Museum. One warm morning in June 2024, while going through a box labeled Memphis Collection 1890 to 1900, she came across an image that immediately stood out. The picture showed a girl around 6 years old sitting in a formal Victorian pose. She wore a white lace dress with fine stitching, and her dark hair was tied back with ribbons. Her hands rested in her lap, her fingers lightly curled. The sepia tones had faded a bit over time, but the picture was still clear. A small brass plate on the frame simply said, Sarah, 1895. Rachel had seen hundreds of portraits like this one, stiff and formal. She was ready to move on until something on the girl's left hand caught her attention. She leaned closer. There was a small round mark about the size of a dime. The raised pattern formed a star-like shape. Rachel's pulse picked up. She recognized it right away. It was a smallpox vaccination scar. She quickly took a photo with her phone, then used a magnifying glass to study it. The scar matched the style of inoculation used in the late 1800s, but something felt off. These scars were almost always on the upper arm, hidden under clothing. This one was right on the child's hand, completely visible. Curious, Rachel checked the catalog entry. The photo had been donated in 1967 by the estate of a Memphis photographer named James Morrison. There was no other information. No family name, no background, nothing. She began searching through more photos from Morrison's collection. Within an hour, she found 3 more portraits from 1895 showing children with similar scars in visible places. One on a hand, one on a forearm, and one even on a child's neck. This wasn't random. These pictures were taken on purpose. But Rachel didn't yet know why. She spent the next week reviewing Memphis newspapers from 1894 and 1895, hoping to find mentions of smallpox. Instead, she found almost nothing. Only 3 short notes in the entire year. One mentioned a few cases in March. Another in June said the situation was under control. And a third in October claimed Memphis had no epidemic concerns. That silence bothered her. Normally, cities of that era shared regular health updates and celebrated good public health. Memphis's papers seemed too quiet. She expanded her search. A Nashville newspaper from April 1895 published a brief piece about Memphis enforcing a quarantine and nearby counties reporting illness. Yet Memphis newspaper said nothing about any quarantine at all. Rachel reached out to Dr. Michael Foster, a historian who specialized in Memphis during that period. He replied quickly and told her to check the city council minutes from 1895. They weren't online, so she had to come to Memphis. 3 days later, she was in the library's special collections room. Most of the council notes covered routine business until she reached a confidential entry dated February 12, 1895. It reported an outbreak of variola or smallpox at the Canfield Asylum for Orphan Children. 47 children were infected. The council voted to keep the information private to avoid panic and protect an upcoming cotton exposition. The health commissioner was given full discretion to manage the situation quietly. Rachel's hands shook as she documented the page. One orphanage alone had nearly 50 sick children, and the city had chosen to hide it. More entries followed. In March, officials reported the situation was contained with minimal casualties. In April, preparations for the exposition were still moving forward, and the council noted no public health concerns. The language was calm, but the truth was clear. Children had died, and the facts had been kept from the public. Rachel continued her research in the library's local history section. She learned that the Canfield Asylum operated from 1887 to 1899 and housed around 40 to 60 children at any time. A promotional booklet from 1893 described it as a modern facility providing care and education. It included an illustration of a brick building with children playing in a fence yard. After 1895, however, references to the asylum almost disappeared. The 1896 directory showed reduced capacity. By 1899, the asylum had closed, and the property was sold to a textile company. A short article about the closure mentioned declining enrollment and financial strain, but offered no real explanation. Rachel requested death records from the city. When they arrived 2 weeks later, the files were incomplete. Dozens of certificates were missing from February and March of 1895. She found 4 records from the asylum during that period. All were for children aged 4 to 8. Causes of death were listed as fever or pneumonia. None mentioned smallpox, even though the disease required official reporting. Rachel understood why. Listing smallpox would have triggered state involvement, quarantines, and possible closure. By writing generic causes, officials avoided outside intervention. She also found records showing that a section of Oak Grove Cemetery had been purchased by the city in February 1895. Today, that area is an unmarked, grassy field with no stones. It was clear it had been used as a burial site for the children who did not survive. Standing at the edge of that quiet field, Rachel thought about the 43 children who were never acknowledged in public records and about the handful who survived. She still needed to learn more about James Morrison, the photographer who captured their images. City directories showed that his studio operated from 1889 to 1896. Then his trail vanished. She found an old newspaper ad for his studio offering portrait services and special rates for charitable groups. That detail stood out. A major lead appeared when Rachel shared her research on a historical photography forum. A woman named Patricia Morrison Chun from Seattle contacted her, explaining that James Morrison was her great-great-grandfather and that her family still had some of his papers. Rachel flew out to meet her. Patricia welcomed her into a home filled with carefully kept family items. She explained that James left Memphis abruptly in 1896. According to family stories, he had been threatened. He moved to Oregon, slightly altered his last name, and never spoke of his time in Tennessee. Patricia handed Rachel an old journal that had belonged to him. Inside, entries from January 1895 describe how he was approached by a woman from the Memphis Sanitary Reform Association. She told him that children at the Canfield Asylum were dying and asked him to help document what was happening. The journal went on to describe meetings with reformers, conversations with doctors who had been directed to change death records, and eventually, the decision to photograph the surviving children. Morrison's next journal entries filled in more of the story. One dated February 28, 1895, described what he saw when he visited the Canfield Asylum with Mrs. Whitmore. He wrote that many children were still in quarantine, some very sick, but a small number had survived. Mrs. Whitmore suggested photographing them and documenting their scars, so there would be proof no one could deny. The city could change paperwork, but photos would show the truth. Morrison agreed, even though he understood the risk. Rachel read these pages with increasing emotion. Morrison had not just been a photographer. He had stepped into a dangerous situation to make sure someone recorded what happened. His journal explained how he spent March and April 1895 photographing 7 surviving children, each with marks that challenged the city's claim that nothing unusual had happened. Rachel read these pages with increasing emotion. Morrison had not just been a photographer. He had stepped into a dangerous situation to make sure someone recorded what happened. His journal explained how he spent March and April 1895 photographing 7 surviving children, each with marks that challenged the city's claim that nothing unusual had happened. An entry from March 15, 1895 described photographing Sarah. Morrison noted she was 6 years old and owed her survival to Dr. Nathaniel Hayes, who had vaccinated her even though he had been told not to. Morrison wrote that Dr. Hayes placed a vaccination mark on her hand so it could be seen. He wanted people to understand what had been necessary to keep these children alive. Rachel looked up Dr. Hayes in city medical records. He was an African-American doctor who had worked in Memphis from 1888 to 1896, mainly serving black residents. His medical license had been revoked in May 1896 for unprofessional conduct. Although no details were listed, Morrison's journal explained what really happened. He wrote that Dr. Hayes had been called before the medical board and accused of causing public fear by vaccinating children without approval. In truth, he had saved lives, and officials wanted to silence him. The journal entries grew more tense as spring and summer went on. Morrison wrote about meetings with reform groups, efforts to interest newspapers in the story, and growing pressure from officials to destroy his photos. In an entry dated June 3, 1895, Morrison wrote that two men visited his studio claiming to be concerned citizens. They urged him to distance himself from Mrs. Whitmore's group. When he refused, they hinted that his studio lease was up soon and that complaints about safety violations could appear. The warning was clear. Another entry from August 10, 1895, said that the reform group had been forced to stop their work. They were facing too many threats, and city leaders believed the Cotton Exposition mattered more than anything that might come to light. Morrison wrote that money and pressure had defeated their efforts. Still, he didn't give up. His final entries described hiding copies of all 7 portraits in different places. He wanted to protect the evidence in case he had to leave Memphis. In a note from September 22, 1895, he wrote that he hoped the truth would someday be recognized and that the children who died would not be forgotten. After returning to Memphis, Rachel began learning more about the Memphis Sanitary Reform Association. The group connected to Morrison. She found records in women's clubs and reform publications explaining that the group formed in 1893. They pushed for better sanitation, access to clean water, and improved medical facilities for black residents. Their work, however, created strong backlash. Some newspapers criticized them, claiming they were stepping outside their proper role. Rachel found frequent mentions of Eleanor Whitmore, the woman from Morrison's journal. She came from a well-known Memphis family, had been widowed young, and devoted her time to community work. She supported schools, labor causes, and efforts to protect children. Her personal papers were stored at Rhodes College, where Rachel spent several days reading through letters, meeting notes, and campaign documents. The folder labeled Canfield Correspondence, 1895, contained exactly what she needed. Inside were letters exchanged between Whitmore and Dr. Hayes. One letter from January 20th described the outbreak at the asylum and the lack of action from city officials. Dr. Hayes wrote that he had started vaccinating healthy children, even though he had been told not to. Whitmore wrote back on January 25th, saying she was gathering support and would bring in Morrison to document the situation. Their efforts ultimately failed. Rachel found one of Whitmore's later letters, dated November 1895, where she wrote about the disappointment of realizing that evidence had not been enough to overcome the city's priorities. She wrote that the exposition continued as planned, the city's image stayed intact, and 43 children were gone without public acknowledgement. Dr. Hayes had lost his license. Morrison was still being targeted, and she herself had been dismissed by critics. Rachel knew she needed to identify the children in Morrison's photographs, especially Sarah, the little girl who had first caught her attention. If any of their families were still alive, they deserved to know. She returned to the records of the Canfield Asylum. Many documents were gone due to the building's demolition in 1920, but she found intake logs from 1887 to 1896. Entries from February 1895 listed 52 children living at the asylum. By April, only 9 were left, 7 who survived the outbreak, plus 2 who had been kept apart and never exposed. The rest were listed as transferred or deceased, with no further explanation. Among the survivors was Sarah Mitchell, age 6. She had been admitted in 1893 after her mother's death, when her father could no longer care for her. Notes showed she was vaccinated by an outside doctor in February 1895 and later survived a serious fever. Rachel followed Sarah's trail through adoption and census records. Sarah had been placed with an agency in 1896 and adopted by Catherine and William Brennan, who ran a grocery store in Memphis. Her name was changed to Sarah Brennan. Census files showed she married Robert Clark in 1907, raised 3 children, remained in Memphis for decades, and passed away in 1956 at age 67. She was buried at Elmwood Cemetery. Working with genealogists, Rachel located Sarah's living descendants. Her great-granddaughter, Jennifer Clark Thompson, lived in Memphis. Rachel emailed her with a careful explanation of the research. Jennifer replied the same day, saying her great-grandmother never spoke about her early life and that the family had always wondered why. They met at a coffee shop. Jennifer brought old family photos showing Sarah as an older woman surrounded by her children and grandchildren. Jennifer said Sarah sometimes had nightmares even late in life. She often woke up calling out names, but never explained the memories behind it. She also always tried to cover a scar on her hand. Rachel showed her the 1895 portrait of young Sarah in her lace dress. Jennifer looked at it with tears in her eyes. She recognized the expression instantly. Rachel then told her the full history: the outbreak, the silence that followed, the unmarked graves, the work Morrison preserved, the risks Dr. Hayes took, and the efforts of Eleanor Whitmore. Jennifer sat quietly for a moment before speaking. She said Sarah had survived something unimaginable and that so many others had not. Rachel answered softly that this was why their stories needed to be remembered and that she hoped Jennifer would help make sure of it. Rachel and Jennifer pushed the city to recognize what happened at the Canfield Asylum and to honor the children who died. They contacted the Memphis City Council and asked for an investigation into the suspected mass grave at Oak Grove Cemetery. Officials hesitated at first, but Rachel's evidence was strong. Morrison's photographs and journal, Dr. Hayes' letters, council minutes, missing death records, and cemetery documents. Once Jennifer brought the story to local media, public pressure grew. A radar survey in October 2024 confirmed signs of a large, hidden burial. The city approved a full excavation. In January 2025, archaeologists uncovered the remains of 41 children, ages 3 to 12, buried without markers. Forensic experts found signs of smallpox and poor care, supporting the historical records. News spread nationwide. Relatives of former asylum residents reached out, sharing long-held family questions. Jennifer visited the site, thinking of her great-grandmother Sarah, who survived only because Dr. Hayes vaccinated her. Rachel's research showed how Hayes, Whitmore, and Morrison paid a heavy price for speaking up. The Tennessee Historical Commission later recognized the tragedy and called for a memorial. In September 2025, the children were reburied with individual markers, and a larger memorial listed all 52 who lived at Canfield in 1895. Jennifer spoke at the ceremony, standing beside Sarah's portrait, finally giving the lost children the recognition they never received.